The campfire was already cold when the search team reached Elk Creek Valley. A thin line of smoke had faded hours earlier, leaving behind only ash and charred wood. Nearby, a tent stood half open, its zipper caught midway as if someone had left in a hurry. Inside the tent, sleeping bags were still unrolled. A flashlight lay on its side, its batteries drained. 2 backpacks leaned against the fabric wall, untouched. Food supplies remained sealed, water bottles full, and a folded map marked their planned trail. Nothing suggested preparation for departure. The scene felt frozen in time. Rangers had expected to find 2 students packing or hiking nearby. Instead, they found silence. There was no sign of Mark Rivers and Laura Bennett, both due back at their college campus 2 days earlier. Their car was parked at the trailhead, keys inside the glove compartment, doors locked. The vehicle had not moved since the day they arrived. Rangers noted the disturbing contrast. Plans for a simple weekend camping trip, but no trace of the campers themselves. The ground around the tent showed confusion. A scattering of footprints led into the surrounding brush, but faded quickly on the hard soil. Rangers marked them, uncertain whether they belonged to the missing students or to someone else. By late afternoon, concern deepened. The students were not carrying extra clothes or supplies. The backpacks inside the tent proved that they had not planned to hike far from camp. If they had left, it was sudden. If they had been taken, it was violent. The first call went out to the sheriff's office. Within hours, deputies joined rangers at the site. Photographs were taken. Evidence markers dotted the small clearing. Investigators crouched near the tent, examining the zipper, the seams, and the scattered items. They found no signs of struggle inside, no torn fabric, no blood. Yet the absence of struggle did not bring comfort. By nightfall, search dogs were brought in. The animals circled the tent, sniffed the bedding, and darted toward the tree line. Handlers followed as far as they could, but the scent vanished in dense forest. No discarded clothing, no trail of belongings, no obvious path forward. The following morning, a wider search began. Volunteers, rangers, and deputies fanned out in lines. Helicopters hovered above Elk Creek Valley, their rotors breaking the quiet of the wilderness. From the air, the campsite looked ordinary, almost peaceful, a patch of canvas against green trees. On the ground, the silence was heavier. Searchers found a torn fragment of fabric snagged on a branch not far from the tent. It was small, easily overlooked, and not immediately linked to the missing campers. It was bagged as evidence, but carried little weight in that first chaotic sweep. As hours turned to days, no trace of Mark or Laura emerged. The valley felt endless, and each call from search teams echoed without answer. Rangers replayed the scene in their minds. Untouched food, a cold campfire, backpacks waiting for owners who had never returned. By the 4th day, the atmosphere shifted from urgency to dread. Investigators began to ask not where the students had gone, but what had happened to them. No weather event had struck. No animals had disturbed the camp. Every object spoke of sudden interruption, as if time had stopped the moment they stepped away from their tent. The abandoned campsite told a story without words. It carried no closure, only questions. Why had 2 students vanished from a valley known more for its quiet trails and for danger? Who, if anyone, had reached them before they disappeared? The mystery was sealed inside that tent, in the cold ash of the fire, in the backpacks waiting to be lifted. The answers were somewhere in Elk Creek Valley. But in October 1980, no one could see them. And as investigators stood at the edge of the clearing, staring into the dark timber that surrounded the campsite, one thought lingered. Whatever had happened here, it had left no trace except silence. Mark Rivers was 21 years old when he vanished in Elk Creek Valley. He grew up in Denver, the youngest of 3 brothers, a quiet child who preferred books and maps over crowded rooms. In college, he studied geology, fascinated by the hidden history of rocks and mountains. Professors described him as meticulous, never rushing, never careless. Friends remembered his calm presence and his rare but thoughtful smile. Mark did not chase attention, but he sought the outdoors. Hiking was where he came alive, where silence felt natural and observation became instinct. His notebooks were filled with sketches of rock layers and short notes about valleys and ridges he wanted to explore. For him, a weekend in the wilderness was not a risk. It was a return to the place where he felt most himself. Laura Bennett was 20 years old, a year younger, with an entirely different energy. She was studying environmental science, motivated by the belief that people had a responsibility to protect the land they used. Where Mark was quiet, Laura was determined. She spoke with conviction in classrooms, challenged ideas, and encouraged friends to act instead of simply talk. Her kindness was not loud but constant. Neighbors remembered her helping elderly residents shovel snow in the winter. Classmates recalled her volunteering for cleanup projects without hesitation. She balanced determination with compassion, never letting either part of her personality dominate the other. Mark and Laura met through a campus hiking group. Their bond was not romantic, but built on shared respect for the wilderness. Both found peace in long trails, in carrying only what was necessary, and in leaving no trace behind. Their friendship was steady, defined by quiet trust rather than constant words. When they planned their October 1980 camping trip, it was meant to be routine. Elk Creek Valley was familiar ground for hikers. The trail was not dangerous, the terrain not extreme. For Mark, it was another opportunity to observe geology up close. For Laura, it was a chance to breathe away from lectures and deadlines. For both, it was ordinary until it was not. Their families supported the trip without hesitation. Mark's parents were used to his weekend excursions, knowing he prepared carefully. Laura's family trusted her judgment, describing her as responsible beyond her years. Nothing about the plan suggested danger. But in the days that followed their disappearance, every detail of who they were became magnified. Mark's silence now looked like mystery. Laura's determination looked like courage that may have been tested. Their backpacks and the abandoned tent became symbols of lives interrupted before they could continue. 2 students, full of intention but not reckless. 2 friends, bound by a simple trip into the mountains. That background, so ordinary, became the contrast of an extraordinary disappearance. The community did not remember them as thrill-seekers or risk-takers. They were remembered as careful, thoughtful, and driven. That truth made the unanswered question sharper. If Mark and Laura had vanished, it was not because of carelessness. It was because something stronger had intervened. The search for that answer was only beginning. On October 10th, 1980, a park ranger spotted Mark Rivers and Laura Bennett at the Elk Creek Valley trailhead. They carried light packs, camping gear neatly arranged, and a folded permit tucked inside Laura's pocket. The ranger remembered them as polite and prepared. They signed the logbook, wrote down their route, and disappeared into the trees. That was the last confirmed sighting. Their plan was simple. Hike 3 miles into the valley, set camp near the creek, spend 2 nights, and return by Sunday evening. Neither carried excessive gear. Neither expected danger. To anyone watching, it was an ordinary trip by 2 students who had camped before. By Monday morning, alarms began. Mark had classes that day. Laura had a lab session, but neither appeared on campus. Calls to their dorm rooms went unanswered. At first, it looked like a delay, maybe an extended trip. By Tuesday, families contacted authorities. The search began where the ranger had seen them last. When deputies arrived at Elk Creek Valley, the car confirmed the story. Mark's small sedan was still at the trailhead. Its tires were caked in mud from the drive-in, doors locked, keys resting inside the glove box. The car was a silent marker. They had entered the valley, but they had never returned. Searchers followed the logbook entry to the creekside site. What they found there disturbed them. The tent was half-zipped, pitched firmly but strangely open. Sleeping bags were unrolled, each laid out as if ready for the night. A flashlight rested on the ground, its beam long gone. Food remained in sealed containers, water bottles untouched. Nothing indicated packing or departure. The campfire had burned down, leaving ash and half-charred logs. Rangers noted that it had been doused or abandoned before morning. It was not the mark of hikers finishing their trip. It was a sign of hikers interrupted. The footprints around the site deepened the mystery. Some impressions matched hiking boots consistent with the students. Others were unclear, partially erased by weather and terrain. None led far enough to explain absence. No struggle was obvious, no overturned gear, no broken branches. Yet the silence was unnatural. The first night of searching stretched into morning. Volunteers moved through the valley in grids. Helicopters scanned from above. Dogs caught scents that vanished in thick forest. The searchers expected a clue, a drop jacket, a boot, a note. Instead, they found nothing. Investigators pieced together what little they had. Mark and Laura had arrived, pitched camp, and likely eaten dinner. At some point, they stepped away from the tent. From there, the record ended. Rumors surfaced quickly. Some said they might have argued and walked off separately. Others whispered about strangers in the valley. Hunters, drifters, men no one could identify. A few wondered if an accident had pulled them into the creek or deeper into the timber. But without evidence, every theory collapsed. The strangeness of the abandoned camp unsettled even seasoned rangers. Supplies were intact. Gear was orderly. It was as if the campers had expected to return within minutes, but had never been allowed to. That impression weighed heavily. Whatever had drawn them from their tent had been sudden, and whatever followed had left no trace. Days stretched on, but the silence remained. Their names were called across ridges, their photographs distributed, their faces on flyers tacked to lodge bulletin boards. But Mark and Laura were gone, swallowed by a valley that gave nothing back. For their families, the details of the campsite became unbearable to imagine. Food untouched, belongings waiting, fire extinguished. All the markers of safety remained, but the people who had created them were missing. Investigators returned again and again, hoping the scene might reveal something new. Each time, they saw the same unsettling arrangement. Two lives paused mid-journey, as if time itself had been interrupted. No one could explain how two careful students, known for caution and preparation, could vanish so completely. The valley offered no answers. The tent, the fire, and the car at the trailhead all spoke in fragments, but never in full. By the end of the first week, the questions outweighed the facts. Had someone crossed their path in the night? Had they been forced from camp by a threat invisible to investigators? Or had the wilderness itself swallowed them without warning? What investigators knew was limited. What they feared was darker. Two students had entered Elk Creek Valley in October 1980. Their presence was documented. Their campsite was found. But from the moment they stepped beyond the tent, their trail vanished. And the silence that followed would become one of Colorado's most haunting mysteries. The first search parties began within hours of the campsite discovery. Deputies from the Gunnison County Sheriff's Office moved into Elk Creek Valley alongside rangers, armed with flashlights and radios. Their task was simple in description but overwhelming in reality. Find any trace of Mark Rivers and Laura Bennett. Search dogs were the first to act. Handlers brought them to the tent, letting the animals sniff the bedding and clothing. The dogs bolted into the trees, noses down, handlers struggling to keep up. For a moment, hope surged, but the trail ended abruptly in dense brush. The animals circled, confused, before returning toward camp. Helicopters arrived next. From above, crews scanned the rugged terrain with spotlights. Valleys, ridges, and rocky clearings were illuminated through the night. Nothing stirred. The forest looked undisturbed, as if it swallowed the students whole. By morning, the search expanded. Dozens of volunteers joined deputies, forming lines across the valley. Each carried sticks to probe underbrush, whistles to signal discovery. Their shouts echoed off trees, names called again and again. No voices answered. Detective Daniel Carter, a seasoned investigator with 20 years in law enforcement, took charge. He was methodical, careful not to leap to conclusions. Detective Linda Moreno joined him, younger but sharp, known for her relentless attention to detail. Together, they reviewed the scene, marking what was known and what was missing. The evidence was limited. The tent showed no sign of forced entry. Food remained sealed. The fire had been abandoned in haste, not care. The car at the trailhead confirmed the students had entered the valley but never left. Beyond those facts, the case was empty. Carter requested a sweep of nearby creeks and ridges. Teams waded through icy water, searched rock outcrops, and checked narrow ledges where hikers might fall. Moreno coordinated interviews, speaking with hunters, fishermen, and travelers who had passed through the valley that weekend. None reported anything unusual. The first 48 hours were consumed by movement and expectation. Each radio call sparked anticipation. Each discovery, a scrap of cloth, a boot print, was quickly tested, then dismissed as unrelated. With every passing hour, the sense of urgency deepened into unease. By the third day, frustration began to surface. The valley yielded nothing. Dogs lost the trail repeatedly. Helicopters reported no bodies, no signs of distress. Volunteers searched mile after mile, without success. The investigation felt as if it were chasing shadows. Detectives Carter and Moreno considered possibilities. Could the students have chosen to vanish, leaving their belongings behind? The evidence argued against it. No one abandoned supplies in the wilderness voluntarily. Could an animal attack have driven them from camp? There were no drag marks, no blood, no torn fabric. Could another person have been involved? If so, that person left no trace. The press began circling. Newspapers reported on the missing students, calling it one of Colorado's strangest disappearances. Families spoke publicly, pleading for help but careful not to speculate. Behind the scenes, the tone shifted. Detectives admitted to one another that the leads were collapsing. Carter noted that without physical evidence, the case was turning into guesswork. Moreno pressed for further testing of every item in the tent, hoping for a fingerprint or hair strand that might reveal another presence. But days became a week, and the evidence remained stubbornly silent. What began as a search now carried the weight of mystery. 2 students had entered Elk Creek Valley. Their belongings stayed behind. The land gave no explanation. For detectives, the first wave of hope was over. The trail, so fresh in those first hours, had already gone cold, and with it, the case slipped into uncertainty. The disappearance of Mark Rivers and Laura Bennett struck Gunnison like a blow. In a town where neighbors knew each other by name, the sudden vanishing of 2 college students felt impossible to explain. At first, people expected a quick resolution. Search crews were out, helicopters circled the valley, and surely it was thought the students would be located within days. But as the days stretched into weeks, unease spread to the community. Families gathered in living rooms, trading news clipped from newspapers. The campus at Western Colorado University held vigils, students lighting candles under a sharp autumn wind. Professors who remember Mark's quiet curiosity and Laura's steady determination spoke of them as though they might walk back into class at any moment. At the center of this collective anxiety was Evelyn Rivers, Mark's mother. She was a woman of quiet strength, not given to displays of emotion, but her presence was unmistakable. At press conferences, she stood composed, voice even, her words carefully chosen. She thanked search teams, urged the community to stay engaged, and made it clear that her family would not let the case fade. "My son and Laura are out there," she said, "and until we know what happened, we will not stop asking." Her resolve resonated with many. Volunteers continued to join search efforts even after official resources began to scale back. Local businesses placed photographs of the missing students in their windows. Churches offered prayer services, and the town hall opened its doors for nightly meetings where updates were shared, even when there was little new to report. Still, fear lingered. The wilderness that had always been a source of pride now carried a shadow. Parents warned their children against venturing too far into the mountains. Hunters and hikers spoke of strange quiet in Elk Creek Valley, as though the land itself carried the weight of absence. Whispers began to circulate, subdued but persistent. Some wondered if foul play was involved, if another person had crossed paths with the students. Others speculated about the wilderness itself, that perhaps it held dangers beyond what searchers could see. These conversations rarely appeared in print, but in diners and grocery aisles, they shaped the way the community processed a mystery. For the Bennett family, Laura's absence was marked by silence. Her parents, reluctant to speak publicly, leaned on Evelyn's strength. They attended vigils, sat for interviews when asked, but avoided the spotlight. Their grief was clear in every careful gesture, every pause before answering. Through it all, Evelyn Rivers became the anchor. She organized search fundraisers, pressed detectives for updates, and refused to allow the disappearance to be treated as unsolvable. Her determination created both comfort and pressure. Comfort for those who needed hope, and pressure for investigators who knew the case was already stalling. By the end of the first month, Gunnison no longer treated the disappearance as a passing story. It had become a defining wound, a reminder of how quickly lives could be disrupted, and how even the closest-knit community could be shaken by unanswered questions. The first weeks of the investigation brought a flurry of activity, but little progress. Detectives Daniel Carter and Linda Moreno pursued every tip that reached the station, no matter how unlikely it seemed. The case was young, and there was still hope that a breakthrough might be hidden in the noise. One of the earliest leads centered on a group of drifters passing through Gunnison. They had been seen near the bus station, carrying heavy packs and moving with restless energy. A witness swore one of them matched Mark's description. The detectives questioned them for hours, but the men had alibis supported by bus tickets and receipts. None of them had been anywhere near Elk Creek Valley the weekend Mark and Laura disappeared. Another tip came from a rancher who lived on the outskirts of town. He claimed he had heard screams echoing from a valley late one night. Search teams combed the area where he pointed, but found nothing beyond the ordinary sounds of wildlife. The rancher later admitted he had been drinking that evening, and the sound may have been coyotes. Then came the confessions. Within weeks, 3 different individuals stepped forward claiming responsibility for the disappearance. Each story was darker than the last. Abductions, assaults, hidden graves, but none held up against scrutiny. Timelines collapsed, details shifted under questioning, and evidence placed the confessors miles away from a valley. These false admissions drained resources and inflamed public speculation, each one raising hope only to end in disappointment. Detectives Carter and Moreno began to feel the weight of these failures. Every lead that dissolved left them further from answers. Carter, methodical and steady, pushed the team to stay focused. Moreno, sharp and restless, grew visibly frustrated. She remarked in one briefing, "It feels like the truth is right in front of us, but every time we reach, it slips away." The families endured these cycles with quiet anguish. Evelyn Rivers listened to each update, knowing most would end the same way. At first, she attended every press conference, every briefing, but soon she learned to temper her expectations. For the Bennetts, the repeated disappointment deepened their silence. Each false lead was another wound, reopening the uncertainty they were forced to live with each day. As weeks turned into months, locals filled the gaps with speculation. Some whispered about cult activity in the valley, citing strange symbols carved into trees. Others insisted a predator, human or otherwise, was roaming the mountains. A few believed Mark and Laura had staged their disappearance, an idea quickly dismissed by investigators but impossible to fully silence. The detectives followed each theory as far as they could, but none led to solid ground. Dogs brought to the site lost the scent at the edge of the river. Helicopters scanned miles of rugged terrain, without success. The valley itself seemed to erase the students' trail, as if nature had conspired to hide what had happened. Media pressure mounted as well. Reporters demanded explanations of the lack of progress, pressing the detectives in tense interviews. Carter maintained a measured tone, insisting the investigation remain active. Moreno's frustration occasionally slipped through, her clipped answers betraying the reality that they were running out of new directions. By winter, the investigation carried the weight of futility. The campsite remained the only solid piece of evidence, an abandoned tent, untouched supplies, a fire gone cold. Beyond that, everything dissolved into rumor, speculation, and disappointment. In one late-night strategy meeting, Carter finally admitted what others feared. "We are running out of options," he told his team. The room fell silent, the words heavy with the possibility that the truth about Mark Rivers and Laura Bennett might never surface. The case, once filled with urgency and determination, now felt cursed, haunted by false leads, unanswered questions, and a silence that refused to break. The winter snows of 1980 eventually melted, but the search for Mark Rivers and Laura Bennett did not thaw with the changing seasons. By spring, the once relentless investigation had slowed to a crawl. The campsite in Elk Creek Valley had yielded no further clues, and each new effort only circled back to the same dead end. Boxes of evidence, once opened daily, began to gather dust on the shelves of the sheriff's office. Photographs of the abandoned tent, lists of search routes, and transcripts of fruitless interviews became relics of a case that refused to move forward. Detectives Daniel Carter and Linda Moreno remained committed to the first year, but momentum drained with each passing month. The trail was too thin, the silence too deep. Carter retired in 1984, his final report noting that without new evidence, progress is unlikely. Moreno transferred to Denver 2 years later, leaving behind a file that already felt buried by time. The years rolled on. Search efforts grew sporadic, triggered only by the rare discovery of bones in the wilderness. Each one tested, and each one unrelated to Mark or Laura. Every disappointment deepened the sense that the case was dissolving into history. For the families, the passage of time carried its own cruelty. Laura's parents retreated into quiet grief, rarely speaking publicly about their daughter. Her childhood bedroom remained untouched, a silent monument to a life interrupted. Mark's father passed away in 1987, never knowing what had happened to his son. But Evelyn Rivers, Mark's mother, refused to let the silence close in. Composed and determined, she became the voice that would not fade. Year after year, she wrote letters to local authorities, to state officials, even to federal agencies. Each letter carried the same request: do not let this case be forgotten. Most went unanswered. A few received brief acknowledgments, but none produced the answers she sought. She kept a binder of her correspondence, each page marked with dates and notes, a personal record of persistence against the weight of indifference. For her, silence was not an option. Meanwhile, the community that had once whispered about the case moved on. New generations grew up knowing only fragments of the story, retold in half-remembered warnings about the dangers of the valley. The fear that once gripped Elk Creek faded into background caution, replaced by fresher concerns. By the early 1990s, the disappearance of Mark Rivers and Laura Bennett was officially considered a cold case. The files were stored in a backroom, untouched except for the occasional reference by a new detective scanning old records. The official stance was simple. Without new evidence, there was nothing left to pursue. The chilling reality settled in. 2 young lives had vanished, and the truth had vanished with them. Years had passed in silence. Leads had dried up. Families had grown older. And the case that once commanded headlines was now little more than a fading memory in rural Colorado. Still, in a small house on the edge of town, Evelyn Rivers continued to write. Each letter was another reminder that time had not erased her son, nor Laura Bennett. She kept faith that one day, something, no matter how small, would reopen the case. But for now, the truth remained locked in the wilderness, untouched and unspoken, as decades of silence settled over Elk Creek Valley. By the mid-1990s, the case of Mark Rivers and Laura Bennett had been dormant for more than a decade. Officially, it was a cold file, one of many collecting dust in the archives of Gunnison County. Unofficially, it remained an open wound for the families, especially for Evelyn Rivers, who had never stopped writing her letters. That persistence finally met progress when forensic science began to move forward. DNA profiling, once in its infancy, was now gaining traction as a reliable investigative tool. Across the country, old cases were being revisited with methods that had not been available years earlier. In 1996, Colorado authorities reviewed unsolved cases for potential forensic reevaluation. Among the files selected was the Elk Creek Valley disappearance. The evidence boxes were pulled from storage, their contents cataloged again after years of neglect. Photographs had faded slightly, but the physical items remained intact. One piece stood out, a torn fragment of fabric collected from the campsite. It had been sealed in an evidence bag since October 1980, logged as potentially connected to the victim's tent. At the time, it had offered little to investigators. Now it was considered valuable. Technicians carefully prepared the sample for testing. DNA analysis in the 1990s was still limited, but it could detect traces that earlier science would have missed. The process was slow, requiring weeks of meticulous work. When the results came back, they carried the weight of history. The torn fabric contained a partial DNA profile. It did not match either Mark Rivers or Laura Bennett. Instead, it matched a profile already in the national database, entered years earlier after an assault conviction. The name attached to the record was Richard Coleman. Coleman was no stranger to law enforcement. He had a history of violent behavior, including a 1985 arrest for aggravated assault in New Mexico. His DNA had been entered into the system after that conviction, one of thousands collected in the growing database. Until now, his name had never intersected with the disappearance in Elk Creek Valley. The discovery reignited the case. For the first time in 16 years, detectives had a lead that was more than rumor or speculation. Coleman's DNA on the fabric placed him at the campsite, raising questions that could no longer be ignored. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation reopened the file with urgency. Detectives pored over Coleman's history, tracing his movements during the early 1980s. Records showed he had worked seasonal jobs across several western states. In the fall of 1980, he had been in Colorado. Employment logs placed him at a logging camp less than 50 miles from Elk Creek Valley. The circumstantial details aligned with chilling precision. Coleman had the means to be in the area, the temperament to commit violence, and now the forensic evidence to connect him to the scene. When the results were shared with Evelyn Rivers, she listened in silence. For 16 years she had asked for progress, and now she was hearing words she had once feared might never come. The torn fabric, forgotten for decades, had become the key. The revelation shocked the investigative team as well. Carter had retired, Moreno had moved on, and a new generation of detectives now carried the case forward. To them, Coleman's name was not just a suspect. It was a potential answer to a question that had haunted their community for nearly 2 decades. But answers would not come easily. The DNA profile was partial, not complete. It was strong enough to establish presence, but not definitive proof of guilt. Investigators knew they needed more. Still, the breakthrough marked a turning point. What had been sealed by time was now reopened by science. For the first time since 1980, the disappearance of Mark Rivers and Laura Bennett no longer felt like a mystery buried in the wilderness. It was a case alive again, carried forward by a fragment of fabric and the silent trace of DNA. As detectives prepared to track Richard Coleman, the families braced for what might follow: truth, justice, or another disappointment. Detective Miguel Rodriguez was 32 years old when the Elk Creek Valley case landed on his desk. Newly assigned to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Unit, he brought with him a reputation for precision and persistence. Where others saw closed files, Rodriguez saw unfinished stories waiting to be solved. The DNA hit from Richard Coleman had breathed new life into the case, but it was Rodriguez who transformed it into a full pursuit. He began by spreading the evidence across his office: photographs of the abandoned tent, transcripts of witness statements, maps of search grids, and the torn fabric that had carried Coleman's genetic trace. Rodriguez read the old reports line by line, making notes of the margins, highlighting overlooked details. What struck him most was not what the files contained, but what they lacked. The investigation had stalled in 1980 because the trail was thin, but Rodriguez believed connections had been missed. He made it his mission to find them. The detective requested Coleman's full history from state and federal agencies. The file painted a troubling picture. Coleman had been arrested multiple times for violence, each case more serious than the last. He drifted from one seasonal job to another, rarely staying long in one place. His record showed a pattern of anger and instability, but also a capacity for disappearing into rural communities without leaving much trace. Rodriguez cross-referenced employment logs, travel records, and witness statements from the original investigation. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Coleman had been in Colorado during the fall of 1980. A pay stub placed him at a logging site near Gunnison just weeks before Mark and Laura vanished. Digging deeper, Rodriguez discovered something that earlier investigators had not pursued. A local ranger's report noted seeing a man wandering alone near Elk Creek Valley on October 11, 1980. The same weekend the students disappeared. The description was vague, but Rodriguez compared it to Coleman's known appearance at the time: medium build, dark hair, heavy boots. The similarity was striking. To Rodriguez, These details were not coincidences. They were threads waiting to be tied together. His methodical approach impressed his colleagues, but also set him apart. While other detectives balanced multiple cases, Rodriguez immersed himself fully in Elk Creek. He worked late nights, surrounding himself with evidence boards filled with photographs and timelines, determined to see the story through. When he visited Evelyn Rivers to update her, she noticed his intensity. He spoke carefully, never promising more than he could deliver, but his conviction was clear. "I believe this case can be solved," he told her. After 16 years of waiting, it was the first time Evelyn had heard an investigator speak with such certainty. Rodriguez also pushed for additional forensic testing. Advances since 1996 meant more sensitive techniques were available. He ordered a full re-examination of items from the campsite: sleeping bags, utensils, and clothing. Each item was tested for microscopic traces that might have been overlooked. The process was slow, but Rodriguez insisted on exhausting every possibility. What kept him moving was not only the evidence, but the silence that had hung over the case for so long. He believed justice had been delayed, but not denied. Every overlooked report, every forgotten statement became a piece of the puzzle. By the end of his first year on the case, Rodriguez had built a detailed timeline of Coleman's life in 1980. He had connected the DNA to the tent fabric, the pay stub to the logging site, and the ranger's sighting to the weekend of the disappearance. The picture was not yet complete, but it was sharper than it had ever been. For Rodriguez, this was no longer just a cold case. It was a personal pursuit. And as he prepared to confront Richard Coleman's shadowy past, he knew the next step would either confirm his theory or collapse it entirely. The name that emerged from the shadows of the case was Thomas Hale. At the time of the disappearance in 1980, he had been 28 years old, drifting through Colorado with no fixed address and no clear ties. To most people, he was a face forgotten in passing, a man seen in roadside diners, seasonal camps, and cheap motels. But to investigators, Hale's name soon carried a weight that could not be ignored. Detective Miguel Rodriguez uncovered Hale's history through a web of old records and archive reports. Hale had grown up in Arkansas, leaving home by 17. His youth was marked by instability, fights in school, arrests for petty theft, and stretches of time unaccounted for. By his mid-20s, he was already on the radar of law enforcement in multiple states for violent outbursts and assault charges. What defined Hale's pattern was not only violence, but transience. He never stayed in one place for long. He worked odd jobs, construction, logging, farm labor, then moved on before anyone noticed him. It was a lifestyle that left few footprints, but it was also the kind of life that allowed him to disappear into the Colorado wilderness in 1980, without question. Rodriguez built a psychological profile with the help of experts. Hale displayed traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, a lack of remorse, impulsivity, and a need for dominance. His record showed escalating aggression, with incidents growing more dangerous over time. The profile aligned disturbingly well with the circumstances of the Elk Creek disappearance. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez confirmed Hale's employment in a logging camp near Gunnison in October 1980, the same period when Mark Rivers and Laura Bennett vanished. Pay records placed him within days of the event. Combined with the DNA trace found on the tent fabric, the circle around him tightened. Investigators tracked Hale to Arizona, where he had been living under his own name. He was now in his 40s, heavier, whether by years of drinking and labor, but still carrying the restless edge of a man never fully at peace. When detectives first approached him, Hale denied any connection. He claimed he had never been near Elk Creek Valley, never seen the students, never camped in the area. But the evidence contradicted him at every turn. Rodriguez confronted him with the DNA match, the logging camp records, and the ranger sighting. Piece by piece, the narrative Hale had constructed began to collapse. The interview stretched across several sessions. At first, Hale remained calm, almost casual, brushing off questions with short answers. But as Rodriguez pressed, cracks appeared. His temper flared. He shifted in his chair, his tone sharp and defensive. The detective noted every change, knowing the pressure was working. Finally, after hours of questioning, Hale leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "You already know what happened," he said. It was not an admission, but it opened the door. Rodriguez waited, silent. The room carried the weight of years, the voices of the missing echoing in the stillness. Hale began to speak. The confession unfolded not with emotion, but with cold simplicity. He had been wandering near Elk Creek Valley when he came across the students' campsite. Their laughter and music carried through the trees, pulling him closer. He claimed he only intended to steal food at first, but the confrontation escalated. Anger and impulse overtook him. He described entering the tent, the struggle that followed, the chaos that ended with 2 young lives silenced. His words were flat, almost mechanical, as though he was recounting something ordinary. There was no remorse in his tone, no recognition of the destruction he had caused. The brutality was confirmed by details only the killer could know. The placement of objects in the tent, the torn fabric, the direction of the fire pit. Each fact aligned with the evidence preserved for 16 years. The investigators listened, shaken by the starkness of the truth. For the families, the confession brought both relief and devastation. The darkest fears they had carried for years were now confirmed. Mark and Laura had not wandered off, had not chosen to disappear. They had been victims of a sudden act of violence, their futures stolen in a single night. Rodriguez documented every word, ensuring the record was airtight. The confession would stand not only as proof of Hale's guilt, but as a testament to persistence, the relentless pursuit that had forced the truth from a man who believed time had buried it forever. When Hale finally leaned back in his chair, his voice faded. "It does not matter now," he muttered. But for the families, for Evelyn Rivers, and for the community that had carried the weight of silence, it mattered more than anything. The case that once seemed cursed had at last given up its secret. The tent in Elk Creek Valley, abandoned in 1980, now spoke through the voice of the man who could no longer deny what he had done. The news of Thomas Hale's arrest spread to the small town like wildfire. For 16 long years, Mark Rivers and Laura Bennett's disappearance had lingered as a wound that never healed, a ghost story whispered in diners, classrooms, and church pews. Now, suddenly, the name behind the shadow had a face. Hale, the drifter, the predator hiding in plain sight, was no longer an enigma. He was a man in handcuffs. Detective Rodriguez announced the arrest at a press conference, his voice steady but heavy. Cameras flashed as reporters fired questions. Was Hale acting alone? Why did it take so long? What does this mean for the families? Rodriguez kept his responses measured. The focus, he insisted, was not on the years lost, but on the fact that, finally, there was accountability. For the families, the moment was surreal. Evelyn Rivers sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly together, her composure as unshakable as ever. When asked for comment, she paused for a long time before speaking softly. "This does not bring my son back, but it brings the truth, and truth is what I have prayed for every single day." Her words, calm and deliberate, carried the weight of 16 years of perseverance. The trial began months later, drawing crowds from across the county. Courtrooms that usually heard cases of petty theft or small disputes now buzzed with journalists, locals, and families desperate to see justice unfold. Hale, older now and hardened by years of drifting, sat expressionless at the defense table. His confession, though damning, did not prepare anyone for the chilling lack of remorse in his demeanor. Prosecutors laid out the evidence with precision. The DNA match from the torn tent fabric, testimony from individuals who had crossed paths with Hale during those years, and his own recorded admissions. Step by step, they reconstructed the crime, filling in the long empty blanks. Each revelation was painful, yet necessary. For Mark's sister, Allison, the testimony reopened wounds she thought had scarred over. "It felt like reliving the night all over again," she would later say. For Laura's father, Richard Bennett, the proceedings were a grim reminder of a daughter's bright future extinguished in an instant. Still, they all sat through it day after day, because absence in the courtroom felt like absence from their children's memory. The defense tried to paint Hale as a man shaped by poverty and trauma, suggesting diminished responsibility, but the jury was unmoved. To them, Hale's past did not excuse the brutality of his actions. After weeks of testimony, the verdict came back. Guilty on all count of murder and kidnapping. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When the judge announced a decision, there was no applause, no visible celebration, only silence, heavy, exhausted silence. For the families, justice was not triumph, but a somber acknowledgement that their children's story had an ending, however tragic. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered. Some wept, others stood quietly in support. A pastor who had once led candlelight vigils for Mark and Laura called the verdict a measure of peace after years of torment. Parents clutched their children tighter, reminded of how fragile safety could be. Through it all, Evelyn Rivers remained a central figure. She addressed the crowd with the same quiet strength that carried her through the years. This case shows that silence does not erase truth. Justice may be delayed, but it does not die. My son and Laura will not be forgotten. Her words echoed not just as a mother's grief, but as a statement of resilience, a reminder that persistence, even against time and despair, can bend the course of justice. For a community haunted for nearly 2 decades, Hale's arrest and sentencing marked the closing of a painful chapter. But the aftermath was not simple relief. It was complicated, layered, a mixture of sorrow, vindication, and the heavy knowledge that closure comes at a cost. And so, life in the town moved forward, forever changed, carrying both the scars of the past and the fragile hope that such darkness would never return. The case of Mark Rivers and Laura Bennett stands as a reminder of how fragile safety can be. What began as a simple hiking trip, an adventure filled with youth and promise, ended in silence, leaving 2 families forever altered and a community marked by fear. The wilderness, once seen as a place of beauty and escape, revealed its capacity for isolation, where danger could unfold unseen. For 16 years, the questions lingered. Where did they go? What happened in those final moments? Why had no trace been found? Those unanswered questions haunted every vigil, every prayer, every quiet night, when the families searched for meaning in the absence of truth. The passage of time only deepened the mystery, until persistence and science intersected. A fragment of fabric, preserved in a box for years, carried the thread that would unravel the silence. Justice came slowly, almost reluctantly, but it came. Evelyn Rivers' steadfast determination, the resolve of investigators who refused to let the case remain buried, and the advance of forensic science converged to bring an ending once thought impossible. Yet justice does not erase loss. It cannot return Mark's laughter or Laura's determination. It cannot restore the future stolen. What it offers instead is a measure of truth, a fragile anchor in the face of grief. The story of Mark and Laura will not be remembered only for how it ended, but for the long endurance of those who refuse to forget them. It is a reminder that even decades-old secrets cannot always remain hidden. And in the quiet of the mountains where they last walked, the echoes of their lives remain, a presence both haunting and enduring.